Harvey Weinstein hired, I think, Black Cube, one of the big investigative firm that's staffed by a lot of like Israeli special forces, former officers and things. And they literally infiltrated her friend group as a way to try and find dirt on her. Whistleblowers have higher incidences of divorce, of alcoholism, of major depression.
There were some really aggressive legal tactics used by Theranos' lawyers. At what point is that kind of thing illegal?
When you start trying to expose Russian oligarchs and things like that, then it gets a little scarier. I would not have had this sort of view, and I'd wish someone had talked to me. I mean, one of the most liberating parts about my job is that
Today's episode is sponsored by VXT, the phone system built for law firms. VXT integrates with practice management systems so that when lawyers make calls, their billable time and legal advice can be saved in the right place automatically. 20% of billable time goes unrecorded. A lot of that is phone calls that get forgotten about. Get some of those billables back using VXT. Go to vxt.co.nz or click the link in the description to find out more.
Today, we're joined by one of the most prominent voices in whistleblower law, Mary Inman. With over 30 years of experience, Mary has built a remarkable career. You may have heard of Theranos with Tyler Schultz or international cases like Hyundai. Mary has worked globally and is featured in many books and online. I'm so excited to be talking to Mary about these cases, as I may be considered a fangirl, having read a lot of the books and podcasts. So let's get into it. So to start us off, Mary, welcome to the podcast. I would love for our audience to learn a little bit more about who you are, what you were like growing up as a kid.
So happy to, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I grew up in northern Maine on the Canadian border, which I actually think is important to my identity because I very much now, in retrospect, having lived in the UK, I do now understand that I was close to a Commonwealth country, and I understand the Australians, the Canadians, and the Brits, that there's a certain ethos, and I think I definitely share that. So grew up on the Canadian border, daughter of a school teacher and librarian. So education was very important, a lot of culture and literature and lots of loving, great things. I'm half Italian, so spent good time in New York City with my Italian side of the family. And then really from a pretty early age, was always had sort of a strong chord for justice. I remember very early on, probably in middle school, being in some debate and arguing vociferously for why women needed to be in combat positions in the military in order to be treated equally. So I think from a very young age, I saw myself as an advocate and a bit of an activist. So I think that very much informed my decision to go to law school. Although really at the same time, I've always had a strong parallel streak of music and theater. So absolutely flirted with a profession, a career in the theater. Got so far as doing a summer stock summer where I was in a member of a troupe for a summer repertory theater. Enjoyed that very much, but I think realized that it was going to be a very long road if I was going to go that route. And so it felt like the law and activism allowed me to still use those performance skills, but just direct them in a different way.
When you were growing up, was there a particular area of the law that you were interested in and saw yourself in?
I think it was more general. I'm not sure that definitely looking back, I know that there's transactional lawyers and then there's courtroom litigators. I always saw myself as a litigator. So that was always the fight in me. I wanted to be fighting on the right side as what I perceived as the right side. So I definitely had an amorphous view that I would want to be a litigator in some way, but I don't think that I really knew how or why until much later in my career. It was really honestly not until after law school and after clerking and about a year into my first job that I was approached about the area of law that I occupy now, and which is whistleblower law. But it just came upon me, not necessarily that I chose it. The opportunity arose, and it just satisfied so many of the boxes that I wanted to tick for a fulfilling career. But yeah, I did it. It definitely, I just had a very amorphous idea that, like a lot of young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed lawyers, that I wanted to change the world. I just didn't know how. And I knew that lawyers were always the people who were in the rooms where it happened, proverbially, to quote from Hamilton. And I wanted to be in the room where it happened, where voices were heard and having an influence.
And when you first joined that whistleblower firm, I know that the False Claims Act was not yet constitutional. Can you explain that first of all? And then what was it like? Was it quite uncertain when the way you were practicing law, or?
Yes, it was pretty risky. So looking back on it now, and I feel like I show my age in a good way when I say that, like, lawyers entering the whistleblower field now, it's a very well developed area of the law. At the time that I entered it about 30 years ago, there was really, at least in the United States, there was really only one primary law that allowed whistleblowers to basically serve as confidential informants for the government, to basically stand in the shoes of the government and bring them information when the government's been a victim, typically of procurement fraud. So when I went into the area, I remember seeking counsel from some trusted advisors saying, it's strange because I'm really going to be practicing only under one statute, something called the False Claims Act in the United States. And it's because it's so unusual that the whistleblower gets to stand in the shoes of the government and launch a lawsuit in the name of the government. That part of the law had never been held to be constitutional yet, and was certainly vulnerable to a constitutional challenge. So I remember saying, well, this whole statute could be found to be unconstitutional, and I could be out of a career. But at that point in time, I was very young, and I realized that even if that were to come to pass, I would spend a lot of my time working with prosecutors, because that's what we do as whistleblower lawyers. We help our clients whisper in the ear of government regulators. So I was like, oh, I guess I could always just go find a job with one of those regulators. I'll be well positioned to do that. So it did feel risky. And lo and behold, I think 4 or 5 years into my tenure as a whistleblower lawyer, the Supreme Court did take up the issue. Unfortunately, did find it to be constitutional. Anecdotally, interesting side note, it's because Justice Scalia and Thomas, who are known on the U.S. Supreme Court as strict constructionalists, the False Claims Act was actually adopted during the Civil War. So a lot of the language that we were relying on, they could say it was original intent. It was the original intent of the founders that whistleblowers be given this vaulted status as basically deputized as private attorney generals to help the government bring these cases. So phew, it was a big sigh of relief. And from there, it's just been incredibly serendipitous that these programs have ballooned. So after the False Claims Act, Senator Grassley, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, was a huge proponent for adopting the first whistleblower reward program inside an agency, a TIP program. So the IRS started to roll out the welcome mat for whistleblowers and reward them for information. And then shortly after that, 2008, we had the financial crisis, and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act included a whistleblower reward program. And then that program really put it on the map. The SEC program, which has paid over $1 billion to whistleblowers over the 10 years since its inception. So now we even see programs at the Justice Department, a new Justice Department program. The Treasury Department in the United States has one for money laundering, fraud, and then also sanctions law violations. And last but not least, the Transportation Department has one for safety defects in cars.
Definitely seems like an area that's growing a lot. Do you see it growing any more in the future or evolving in any way?
I love that question because it's quite topical. I do see it evolving. And I think, as I alluded to earlier, I had the great privilege of spending 3 years in the United Kingdom trying to make international whistleblowers aware of our programs. And so the place I see it growing, and we've already seen this happening, is that we are seeing other countries adopting American style rewards, but making them their own. So Canada has 3 programs now. The Ontario Securities Commission, the British Columbia Securities Commission have reward programs. The Canada Revenue Agency has one for offshore tax evasion. And then finally, tomorrow, we're expecting a report to be issued from RUSI, a government think tank associated with the Ministry of Defense in the UK, providing a full-throated endorsement of American-style rewards for helping the UK fight financial crime. So we're starting to see the winds change in this area, and even Australia has routinely flirted with this idea. And I understand from some colleagues in Australia that there is talk of maybe having a reward program to get at bid rigging or anti-competitive behavior. So we'll see. We'll see. Cautiously optimistic that people will see the wisdom of rewards being just one more form of protection for whistleblowers. I think people are used to the idea that whistleblowers deserve protection against retaliation if in their employment capacity, but less known that those cases are very hard to win. And so these kinds of tip programs, in essence, put a financial safety net and almost serve as unemployment insurance for whistleblowers.
Very topical with that coming out tomorrow.
Yeah.
Then hopefully we'll be able to incorporate some of this in the show notes as a little bit of an update. But you mentioned your time in the UK where you were recruiting people to these US programs. I'd love for you to share how you went about that, because when you think of recruitment, we spoke about this previously, but you think of recruitment, it's not employees, but how do you go out and say we need whistleblowers?
Yeah.
Quite a foreign concept.
It's a great question. I think traditionally you think about lawyers meeting their clients on the golf course or at certain conventions and things. The kind of people I'm looking for are usually, certainly in the UK, would be people in the financial sector. So there are a lot of multinational corporations or just companies that have a presence, they're foreign, but have a presence on the US stock markets that are engaged in financial frauds, accounting frauds. So I would often hang out at pubs near the London Stock Exchange. Interestingly, one of my most prominent and favorite clients, although you're not supposed to have favorites, is a whistleblower named Tyler Schultz, who is one of the Theranos whistleblowers, and he exposed Elizabeth Holmes for her blood testing company, Theranos, which ended up basically being a fraud. It wasn't what it was. The product didn't do what it said it could do. And I actually reached out to him affirmatively after reading about him in the newspaper. So looking at the Wall Street Journal article and recognizing he had to incur a lot of attorney's fees defending against a claim that he violated his confidentiality agreement, and was looking at that saying, I don't think he realizes he might have an SEC tip and that would help him potentially recoup some of this money. So yeah, I'm not the kind of lawyer that sits back and waits for clients to come to me. So in the UK, that meant a lot of public speaking, attending conferences, and then just hanging out in the haunts where financial services people hang out.
It sounds like a movie or a book, and it's actually been involved in books. I read the book about Theranos as well, so it's full movie spec.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. It's less about me as their mouthpiece and the lawyers, but more about the whistleblowers themselves and the circumstances that they put themselves in that are often put themselves at incredible risk, either personal to their careers, to their psychosocial health, sometimes even for big frauds involving oligarchs and other folks can be your own personal safety. So it is often feels like the stuff of books. I think one of my cases that most felt like a movie was a client that I had that ended up, I've had a number of clients, but this client in particular was wired up for the FBI. So felt very fraught for him, but also exciting at the same time.
So you mentioned some of the cases just then, and they're very major, well-known cases. Do you have an example of what like a more minor case would be in whistleblowing, but where they'd still have an attorney?
Yeah, so I think I had a very small case or minor case, but I think they can be just as important, but probably not as publicly known, involving customs fraud. So in the United States, and this is very topical now, that when the Trump tariffs came in under Trump 1, a lot of companies decided that instead of paying those tariffs on imported goods, they would just basically engage in a ruse where they would undercount to the customs officials, undervalue the value of their goods so that they'd end up having to pay less in customs duties. And that's how they were going to get around the additional costs. And so those tend to be really fun kind of cases because the fraud is incredibly blatant, because you can imagine they end up having to have dual invoices, double invoicing schemes. So it's pretty easy to prove when you see that the invoice that they actually paid the importer is 50% less than is the actual real price, and what they showed to the customs officers, the second fabricated invoice was 50% less, and it's pretty easy to show those kinds of frauds. So they can be really fun. They tend to be smaller depending on who's involved. But I always joke that the two cases I've had with successes in this area both involved importing women's wear, so retail clothing manufacturers. One from Harrogate, England, actually called the Pure Collection. And then most recently, a company called Alexis, a Miami-based company. So I always joke with my friends that this means that I'm a member of the fashion police now. Different kind of fashion
Nice.
police, but yeah, it's an interesting and lesser known area.
And is it someone at the fashion brands who are the whistleblowers?
Yes,
Yeah.
so often they are people, it's hard to detect, although not impossible. Sometimes competitors can see this kind of fraud. We have seen cases, a case involving a tool manufacturer called King Kong Tools. It wasn't a case of mine, but just a case that I followed. And a competitor could see they used the same manufacturer in China, and they could see how their goods cost so much. The exact same good costs a lot less in the United States. And they were claiming that these parts were made in Germany, but lo and behold, when they went on a tour of the factory in China, they saw the stamp of this King Kong tool there. So actually the competitor was able to be the whistleblower and succeeded in that case. But that's unusual. It's usually someone from the inside. So it's usually someone who worked in the retail business for the actual importing company. So it would be a member of the staff of the fashion line, because they're seeing these dual invoices and you start to ask questions. You're like, well, why? Or if you're asked to sign these or to be somehow complicit, you start to get concerned.
I was just watching a Netflix show and it sounded like what you just explained. It was medical devices though, and they were claiming they were made in the United States, but they were made in China, and it was all about the repackaging. And like, they must base these shows on the real cases that are actually happening.
Yeah, real cases are fascinating. Fraud is always fascinating, right? Because you think about the psychology of it. That's one of the most interesting pieces for me, is that I don't think most people start out intending to commit fraud. But like in this case, you imagine the Trump tariffs come in and you start thinking about your ROI and what's this going to mean for my shareholders if you're that big of a company. And then maybe you just start with one transgression and then it can often balloon.
Yeah. And so you gave a brief introduction to the Theranos case where you represented Tyler Schultz. From my understanding, there were some really aggressive legal tactics used by Theranos's lawyers, including ambushing Tyler at his grandfather's house to sign documents. Is this common in these types of cases? And at what point is that kind of thing illegal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, it is all too common for some of these very large cases where the target has a lot to lose and has a very large budget. So, in Tyler's case, as in other big cases that I've seen and other ones that your listeners will know from the news, like you will regularly see firms hiring private investigators to follow the whistleblowers. The use of NDAs and aggressively trying to enforce them is another way you try and exact a toll on the whistleblower to try and force them into silence or intimidate them. So it is something that we see pretty regularly. It really depends on how it can cross the line. It's interesting. The other two cases I'm thinking of where there was aggressive use of surveillance of whistleblowers was the conservatorship for Britney Spears. Actually, one of the security officers was the whistleblower, and he came to see that they were being asked on behalf of her father, who was in charge of the conservatorship. He was asked to basically record things that were happening in her bedroom, things that had gone just like way too far. And when he heard Brittany talk about that in court and how she wanted to really resist the conservatorship, he felt pangs of sympathy and decided to blow the whistle. So you can see that there. You saw it again in the Me Too movement. Rose McGowan was one of the first whistleblowers to speak out against Harvey Weinstein, and Harvey Weinstein hired, I think, Black Cube, one of the big investigative firm that's staffed by a lot of like Israeli special forces, former officers and things. And they literally infiltrated her friend group as a way to try and find dirt on her. I always say it's almost a medieval tactic that we resort to in our medieval mindset to shoot the messenger as a way to divert attention from the message. But unfortunately, hopefully in the most part that backfires. But people tend to be very vindictive. And so rather than seeing it as a growth opportunity or recognizing this person as actually not disloyal, but one of your most loyal employees, someone who has the temerity to speak up and point out problems to help you avoid risk. The instinct, unfortunately, that's ingrained in us is to get defensive and blame the person who's trying to point out the wrongdoing. So yeah, I've seen a lot of tactics like that. Those are just a few examples. It's interesting. One of the ones that I thought was the most insidious was a Trump whistleblower. So a whistleblower who worked inside the White House and was in charge of, and this person had been doing it for years in the White House, regardless, through multiple administrations, Democratic, Republican, the whole way through. And so when she started to say that like Jared Kushner's file raised some concerns, she started to get pushback, and they really pressed that they wanted her to not apply the rules in the same way. And what they did to retaliate against her is she's a woman of diminutive status, and so she has dwarfism, and they would put all of the files out of her reach. That's how juvenile it gets and insidious it gets. So I just never cease to be amazed by the tactics.
Yeah. That's crazy. Do you ever see it changing in the future, that there's more protection against these kind of tactics?
Yeah, I think we're seeing some really great developments, at least on NDAs, right? That thanks to a whistleblower named Afoma Azoma, African-American woman who accused Pinterest, her employer, of race and sex discrimination and felt silenced by her NDA, actually took that action and helped get laws passed in both the states of Washington State and California, something called the Silence No More Act. So basically finding these kinds of provisions unenforceable. So I think we are pushing back, and we are seeing some changes, but I think we have farther to go. In our Trade Secrets Act, we've included provisions that allow so that, because whistleblowers are routinely accused of violating trade secrets. And that certainly was one of the things Theranos was trying to pin on Tyler. And Tyler famously said, fraud is not a trade secret. But there has been language put in there allowing whistleblowers to bring information to lawyers and law enforcement that could be considered proprietary. So we're getting better at it. We still have a ways to go, though.
And is there any advice you give to your clients who come to you before they might be starting any case that you're like, this is what you're getting in for, or what you need to be careful and prepared for?
Yeah, I always joke and say that I wear my lawyer hat when I do a legal analysis of someone's case. But if I think that it's the kind of case that could succeed, I tell them that and then take off my lawyer hat and walk through the potential parade of horribles that could ensue. I make a point of trying to involve, if they're willing, to have the clients involved, their significant others, their spouses in the decision. There's just a lot of empirical data coming out of New England Journal of Medicine and other studies that were done that just show that whistleblowers have higher incidences of divorce, of alcoholism, of major depression, things like that, that it obviously takes a real toll. So I like to talk about all of that and the resources that are available, just and to really test, do you think you're up for this? Are you prepared for this? Because I think when whistleblowers are often faced with the decision whether to blow the whistle or not, I always say they're in extremis. They're often in a position where they have been quite aggressively retaliated against and they've been gaslit, and they feel completely barraged, under attack. That's not the best mindset for making a decision about something that will have repercussions for you for the rest of your career. So I try and slow things down for a moment and help them occupy that space about, what does this really mean? I know you really want to lash out and you want justice, and so would I if I were in your shoes, but let's talk about what that might mean, and let's just talk about what that might do to you and your family.
If they decide that maybe it's not the right thing for them and their family, is there ever like another route they can go down, or is it you just have to let it be?
I love that question, Sophie, because it allows me to talk about a new nonprofit that I'm a founding board member of that we just launched called PST.org, PST.org, and it seeks to deal with this binary, non-binary choice that you're talking about. Like, you either blow the whistle or you don't. It's either you, David, versus Goliath, the corporation. We're actively, so his goal is to really try and fill the need that exists right now for, in particular, tech whistleblowers and AI whistleblowers. It's hard to blow the whistle in an area that's not regulated yet, because all the protections don't apply if you're not necessarily pointing out an illegality. So what we're trying to achieve, and we have something called the SAFE, is to allow people to deposit information. So in that scenario that you said, well, maybe I don't feel that I'm able to deposit, to actually physically sound the alarm and be a whistleblower right now, but I really want to do something with that information. So what the SAFE offers is an opportunity for your information to sit, and if you agree, in what we call information escrow, and to sit there. And then if other people are feeding in similar information, you can agree to be contacted later when more people have said the same thing or have said it from different pieces of the puzzle. So if you think, for instance, about the Boeing whistleblowers, there are so many there, the VW whistleblowers for emissions cheating, Wirecard, you could go on and on with whatever your favorite scandal is. If we could have put those whistleblowers together as a collective, the burden on them is there's safety in numbers, so it's more protective of them, but it also it defeats this dynamic we were just talking about, where it's easy to send a private investigator and to have a smear campaign when it's just one person. But when it's 12 of you, you're not going to be able to discredit all of them. Not all of them can be horrible individuals or disgruntled employees or whatever ruse they like to generate or myth. So that's our hope. Is we keep saying we want to fight tech with tech. So would ultimately have an algorithm that would help create these matches when you deposit information into the vault. We would have matches on different types of fraud, and then you could potentially speak as a collective and have some solidarity. And in that way, it might appear more like collective action.
The first thing that comes to my mind, because you said fight tech with tech, is if people are going to start using bad tactics, if they hear people starting to put information in here, did it have to be built in a way that's like really hard to hack? Because
yes.
Yeah, is it a consideration?
Yes. Oh, yes. And that's why I think I'm able to say that we have partnered with Harvard's Berkman Klein Center. So we've got some really great tech minds trying to find a way for us to create it in a way that's very safe for these people, because you've identified the vulnerability. If you're going to put your data in there, how do we? It's not just encryption keys. There's some amazing tech that folks like Signal, the Signal app, and other people know how to use that keeps the information in a way that even I couldn't access until the right time. So just the computer's deciding the match.
Yeah.
And until then, it does sit, and I don't have a key. So, if, for instance, if the government subpoenaed me, I'd say I don't have it. That's hopefully the plausible deniability. But we're still beta testing, but it's really exciting. And to have Harvard as a partner is very exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. And relating it to when you're working on cases, what kind of role do journalists play in how well a case goes, and like how can they help in cases?
Well, journalists, as I said with Tyler's case, are often my rainmakers. They help me find the clients in some ways. But yeah, it depends on, they can be incredibly important. They can also be sometimes inadvertently end up being a fly in the ointment for some whistleblowers, because if you go to the media too soon, then it will often undermine your chances to get a whistleblower reward and to cooperate with these government agencies, because a lot of them say for eligibility purposes, to be eligible as a whistleblower, for instance, under the SEC program, you have to come to them voluntarily. And so if they come to you first after they've read your profile in the Wall Street Journal, then you really need to have filed before. So for the most part, the press can be an ally, but sometimes unbeknownst to them, they can sometimes not necessarily be serving the whistleblower's full interests. But typically they help shine a light, right? And one of my favorite examples is really of our firm. My partners represent Ed Pearson, who's one of the Boeing 737 MAX whistleblowers. And he had a long journey, and where he did testify in front of Congress. He was featured in the New York Times, but he had strong headwinds because the FAA was buying what Boeing was selling, because his argument, from what he observed firsthand, was that the problems were not just software glitches, which is what happened when the first two flights went down, the Ethiopia Airlines, the other flight, but it was on the production floor, and that's what he kept saying. But it really wasn't until the Alaska Airlines door blew off that he was finally vindicated. And so it can be a long journey. And so the regulator doesn't always take enforcement action. And when they do, it's not always what you want. So in Ed's case, the FAA, it was only until for years went by before the door went off and before a real audit from the FAA came in on the production facility of Boeing. So what media did for him is he was featured in a documentary called Flight Risk. And that really gave him the megaphone to finally tell the story from the whole story from his point of view. So I think in that way, media, if they're handling whistleblowers responsibly, if you've got responsible media, they can actually be really a big part of a whistleblower's empowerment in getting over the trauma and all the loss of someone like Ed lost his whole family at Boeing. Boeing felt like a family to him, right? And he had to rebuild. And now he has an aviation nonprofit. And so he has. But I think the film, the process of actually getting to tell his story and process that in that way can be really empowering. And maybe the first time that a whistleblower feels like their full story has been heard. So I feel like the media plays a bunch of different roles. And I think one of the most interesting ones right now is the role the media plays in like the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers and these big data leak kind of cases also, right? Is that they've upended their traditional model where each outlet is competing for a story and they're collaborating, right? And they have these massive data dumps that, I would say the people who are leaking in a way are a form of whistleblower. And that has been another interesting place to see the media to get some of these big stories out. So, yeah.
Getting a story shared is quite often maybe towards the end of a whistleblower's journey. And at the end also sometimes people are able to get a reward. And you shared a story about Mr. Kim, a South Korean man who ended up getting a $24 million reward. How are these rewards calculated?
That's a great question. So, just to wind back just a little bit for the audience, Mr. Kim is a South Korean whistleblower. And so, it's a great example of how people from far across the globe can still participate in the American whistleblower program. So, he worked as a quality assurance manager for Hyundai in their automotive plants outside of Seoul. And he observed and tried to report internally and did report internally about problems with their engines that caused fire and other issues and real safety concerns, and was largely ignored. And because of the power that Hyundai has in South Korea, I think some criminal law enforcement folks ransacked did search on his house, like other things that were clearly, again, trying to send the message that he needed to be quiet and he upset the wrong people. He ends up going with his daughter, because he doesn't speak English, taking his daughter with him to Washington, D.C. to report to the Transportation Department about this. And as a result of that information, the Transportation Department imposed a massive fine against Hyundai. And so, in terms of how do we calculate his $24 million, he got a percentage of the amount of the fine, an amount of the penalties. And so the range is 10 to 30% for most of the programs. And where you fit in that range depends on basically the amount that you cooperated and contributed to the Transportation Department's investigation. Obviously, here he was enormously helpful, I think, but for Mr. Kim coming forward, they wouldn't have known about a lot of this. He obviously undertook a lot of risk to himself to do that. So he got on the higher end. But usually, the government, once they've imposed the fine, then we typically negotiate with the government about what we think our client should get. And hopefully it's what we think they deserve. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we have to negotiate it or appeal it. In the case of Mr. Kim, we were happy with what they offered him, and he was too.
Wow. And when a client first comes to you and they're obviously very scared about sharing this information, how do you go about building trust with them, and what can they share with you that will be protected?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, luckily, the attorney client privilege laws in the United States are quite robust. So, they can be quite sure that what the information that they give us, we will basically take to our graves, and unless and until they authorize us to use it, we're not able to do anything with it. We would be violating our ethical codes. So, the information is very safe with us. I think some of what we have to do is, in terms of building trust, is getting them. I almost talk about when you have been a whistleblower, you've often been basically suffered workplace injury. There's even concepts now about moral injury and what it means to be it's not just retaliation, but just that place that people are often put in, right? They've often been constructively discharged. They no longer, and they're often just shocked, right? That they're like, they don't even expect, they don't even think necessarily that they're whistleblowing. If you're the head of internal audit and you release a report that shows that an enormous amount of money needs to be paid back to the government or a contractor or something like that, and the company doesn't want to do it and wants to sweep it under the rug, then you've brought forward an inconvenient truth for them, and they're often going to scapegoat you, right? Because now you're the deliverer of the bad news. So you'll often have lost your friend group at work, which for a lot of people can be a very significant part of your support group. And then you can often just start to doubt yourself, right? Well, why does everybody else think that this is okay? Then you start to gaslight yourself in a way. So when they come to me, how I build trust is that often I'm the first person who will say to them, you're right. This really happened. This is wrong. You're not inventing things. This isn't, and this is often what happens as a corporate playbook. We see this time and time again. And so they will, and I will then predict what's going to happen often. So if they've come to me and they haven't been fired yet, I will start to say things like, it really looks like they're preparing to get rid of you. And then once those sorts of things start happening, they'll come back to me like, how did you know that? So I think these are ways that I build trust, is that I listen and I give them, I'm probably the first voice that finally starts to turn the tide to let them trust their own voice. And the other way you build trust is you don't pull punches in terms of just saying, this is going to be a really tough road to hoe. And I'm very honest about what their chances might be and what the repercussions are. And I think that isn't always easy to hear, but that most people really want to hear the unvarnished truth. So I think that's how I do it. But it's mostly a lot just with that I really care about my clients, and I want to support them in the legal analysis, but also just in recognizing that it's hard what they've done, and giving them constructive advice of, you need to seek help, potential therapy, you need to start building new friend groups because you just lost after the loss, and you need new connections and new community. So it's that kind of thing, that they understand that I'm there to try and get them to deal, or at least help assess and take stock of what just happened. To bear witness. I guess part of what I'm doing is helping them bear witness to something that is quite traumatic.
As a lawyer for whistleblowers, do you ever find that you've developed enemies of your own? Like, not from your perspective, but other people crossing the line in terms of you being the attorney for the whistleblower?
Yeah, I definitely, as we do work in this new sanctions law program and money laundering programs, you start to deal with a level of defendant that is scary. So I think not dissimilar to criminal prosecutors who have their names on the indictments and things like that. I think we're more in the background, but it's a similar feeling that you can imagine. I can imagine. I sometimes think about when I'm flying through certain countries that I wouldn't necessarily want to be there, just because of the line of work that I do and some of the people that my clients have helped expose. So yeah, but that's a more recent development for me. I did spend most of my career doing Medicare fraud and defense contractor fraud, and not that hadn't seemed quite as fraught as when you start trying to expose Russian oligarchs and things like that. Then it gets a little scarier.
For someone that might be interested in getting into the field of whistleblower law, outside of becoming expert at the law itself, is there any type of expertise or skills that you think that they should work on?
That's a great question. The law is part of it, but I would say, just from my group, I'm just incredibly fortunate to work with a group of, there's about 13 of us, and I guess what we share in addition to obviously a command of the law, is a real passion for the work. And so I think what I would, and I often suggest to lawyers starting in the profession, is that to find an area that really moves you in a way that, it's more of a calling and less of a job. So maybe whistleblowing is it, maybe it isn't, but to just sort of not settle necessarily for something that you're not passionate about, because there's enormous pleasure to be derived, not just from the substantive law, but also from the type of clients you're going to be interacting with. It's a great pleasure of mine to have my law partners who I adore and who have a similar philosophy as I do. But my clients inspire me every day. So I'm inspired by my law partners. I'm inspired by my clients. I'm inspired by the government, civil servants who decided to forego the fancy big salary jobs and are out there trying to prosecute these kinds of cases and represent the interests of, the citizens, of we the people. So I guess that would be my advice, is to step back from the law for a minute and think about it in the big picture. And I would even say one more thing, which is interesting. I would not have had this sort of view, and I'd wish someone had talked to me. One of the most liberating parts about my job is that I do not get paid hourly. I get paid on a contingency fee or success fee basis. And what that means, because I did work for a year at a big civil defense firm, and just the dynamic shift between a client who at my big civil firm seemed to resent having to pay this crazy hourly rate, to my whistleblower clients who see me as a partner, as someone who I clearly am not going to take their case unless I think it's going to succeed. So it's it's much more entrepreneurial in that way, but very liberating. And your clients are very appreciative, right? That they feel like they're investing in this case. They're taking some of the risk that I'm taking. So I don't think I had thought about all of those things as a young lawyer, but it's a lot of what makes my work so rewarding. So I guess I would encourage lawyers to get under the hood and think about, what does this new area of the law for you, or practice area, mean for you? And I guess the last thing I'd say, because I have a lot to say about this clearly, is not to be scared of plaintiffs or claimant side work. I think it gets a very bad rap. And most law schools are not going to give you networking opportunities in that area. So you're going to have to make your own path. That was certainly how I found it. And so I would encourage folks to look at more than what just your career advancement office or your network offers you, to cast your net more broadly.
I imagine with you mentioning the contingency-based billing, I feel like that's another element that really helps build trust with the people you're working with as well, because like you said, it's a partnership rather than you're just charging fees and trying to make money.
Yeah.
A lot more trust there.
Yeah.
The passion you mentioned for this area of law, is that why you recently started your own firm?
It absolutely is. So it just is. I think it's been really important in my career to be able to be surrounded by people who are completely in the common mission. And so there's just no substitute for being your own boss and having command of your own ship and how you want to create your own culture. It's interesting. We spend a lot of time in the whistleblower field talking about toxic corporate cultures that lead to these kinds of frauds. So it is just really nice to be able to set your own culture and create your own environment and basically self-select who you want to practice with. All of us had practiced for at least about 10 years together. Some of us for like 30 years. So it was really fun to have our own place because we share a very common vision for how to run an operation. We're very flat, team oriented. We're recognizing that a lot of these cases, all of our cases, require a team effort. It's not just the rainmaker. It's not just the litigator that's the courtroom mouthpiece. It's all of us are rowing in the same direction to get these victories. So that feels really good. I think one of the other big reasons is that when you are at a bigger firm, while there are lots of advantages to being at big firms in terms of resources and other things, you will often generate conflicts that you don't want to generate for yourself. So if you have a different practice area that may be bringing in clients that are actually clients you want to sue, that can be really difficult. So that was another really lovely part. And it's just really lovely to be able to, from that tying into that conflicts part, to be able to say to our clients, this is all we do. We don't represent companies, right? We sue them so that they don't have to worry that some other part of our firm does a different kind of work that seems to undermine what we stand for. So yeah, it's just been really great to be specialized and to be a boutique and to stick with what we know.
Outside of culture, which you just mentioned, is there anything else that you've been able to or enjoyed being able to do differently or try different things that you weren't able to do in a large firm?
Well, it's interesting. We've been very scrappy because we have our financing model means we don't have quite the same amount of resources we used to. So we do a lot of retreats. We do a lot of like gatherings at each other's houses and things like that to really bring ourselves closer together. So I'm trying to think if we start traditions. We have a lot of fun together. So I'm trying to think, we used to have a special, I think it was just like a special ornament that if you got a really interesting case or something, it would get passed to you and you'd get it for the year and then you'd get to decide who gets it next. So we've had little traditions like that to keep it fun. I actually have right behind me, I have a kazoo and an accordion. So that is what I'm known for in our firm is if something good happens, then I of course I always have this to play when there's been a big.
Oh my
So we do stuff like that to keep it fun.
God. I love it.
Not a whistle, but a kazoo.
What's the difference between a whistle and a kazoo?
Well, a kazoo is you hum into it and it's got a really annoying sound. And so it's funny. I'll show you one. So you didn't know I had props. I always talk about that there is a whole diversity of whistles, right? I think everybody just thinks about the bobby whistle. This is actually a slide whistle. So a whistle is like this, and then a kazoo you hum into. So it's just kind of fun to signal when something good is happening. Everyone will say, "Bring out the kazoos."
Very fitting having many different types of whistles for
Yes,
a whistleblowing firm.
exactly. A diversity of whistles for sure. And the slide whistle is my favorite because it's comic and I love to laugh. So
I love it. I've loved chatting about the field of work you're in and getting to know more about you. I really enjoyed it. To finish it off, I have some quickfire questions, which you can reply with just a sentence or word, whatever comes to your mind. First of all, you have hinted towards this already, but what has been the most rewarding case that you've worked on?
I've got to say Tyler Schultz's case, just because I'm so proud of him and what he's accomplished. It's just been a real pleasure working with him.
Nice. And you've also hinted to this one, but if you hadn't become an attorney, what would be your dream job?
To teach theater at a community theater.
Nice. And if you could have dinner with anybody who is dead or alive, who would you have dinner with?
Oh, that's such a good one. Gertrude Stein. Gertrude Stein would host salons in Paris. She was an American in Paris, and she would have all of the luminaries come to her salon. And it was just a gathering of artists and the thought leaders of the day. She was a real sort of organizer and force of nature. So yes, I'd want to have dinner with Gertrude Stein, but more importantly, I'd want to go to her salons.
Nice. And lastly, if you could relive any moment in your career, what moment would you relive?
I would probably relive a moment where I helped a whistleblower who's very dear to me, who's since passed away, who was getting ready to wear a wire for the FBI and break a whole case open. He was just very dear to me, and we had worked so hard to persuade the government to basically take this extraordinary step and execute a search warrant. And wearing the wire was part of what got to that point. So that was a real highlight for sure, is on an individual level, preparing someone to get that capture that kind of evidence and to persuade the government to use it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Mary. Like I said, I've loved this conversation. If anyone would like to follow along with you or get in contact with you, how can they best do that?
Yeah, so I'm now on Blue Sky. I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can find me on our website. Those are the most of the places where you can find me.
Nice. And I'll link those in the show notes.
Excellent.
Thanks, Mary.
Great. Sophie, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.